Well, friends, it's time to get moving. Welcome to everyone, all of you here present, and of course, all our online participants. We're very pleased to have everyone here with us at this time. As you know, those of you who are attending the series as a whole, this is the 4th week, and we're going to reach the halfway mark. And today, the main focus will be on relations between the 3 great powers, the United States, Russia, and China. And in many ways, that relationship or relationships are at a very dangerous low, as I think we will see. They didn't stay that way, but time will tell. Before I start, I want to, just a couple of preliminary things I want to run through with you. The first thing is, I've been saying in previous weeks that the program is tight. Tonight, it's tighter still. And so we need, I'm afraid, to work by the minute. So we're going to have an early break because that's the only way we could organize our 2 guests to join us, one from Paris and the other from Moscow. So that'll be at 7. The break comes before that, roughly 1:45, give or take, but we need to be sitting down at 1 minute to 7. There's no give, because it'd be a bit of a nuisance to have people troopsing in, sound problems, etc. So please, I know you're going to have an animated conversation possibly before that, but you can continue the conversation informally as you grab a drink or whatever. That's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to mention is that, of course, every bit of the program has been thought through fairly carefully. And the idea is, as we're going from one major issue to another, we are at the same time moving a little bit from analysis to suggesting ways forward, and then to thinking through how can we make anything that's worthwhile happen. So for those who are attending for the 7 weeks or attending a number of the ones yet to come, there's homework. And everyone does the homework. There's no such thing as I couldn't. It does not exist. It does not exist. And all 3 conversations in the weeks that follow will depend on the home. You don't do it, you'll have nothing to say. Absolutely nothing to say that is relevant. But not only that, it's a small piece of homework, which we will deal with a bit later. So in terms of thinking, presenting some ideas about the way forward, this will be the last segment when I'll make a presentation, and then we'll take questions or brief comments from both here and from our online people. So in terms of where to from here, that is the last hour or so, okay? So that's probably where we need to be particularly alert, as concentration might flag just a little, especially if one's been at work and had a big day already before coming here. Okay. So what I want to do in these first, shall we say, 20 or so minutes is to give you a few tidbits about the backdrop against which it'll be possible, I think, to make sense of what our guests may have to present to us. And the first thing I want to bring to your attention is the post-Cold War era. Now, I know some people may not have even been born, I don't know, when the Cold War came to an end, more or less in 1989. And I think it's fair to say, so that you know where I'm going, that the way relations have soured between these three major centers of power have brought us to a low unlike anything we had during the Cold War. Now, that's a big statement, I know, but I'm making it. More serious than the Berlin crisis of the 50s, 49 and 50s, more serious than the Korean War, more serious than the Cuban Missile Crisis, and more serious than the Vietnam War. No question about it. No question about it. Why do I say that? Well, for reasons that will become perhaps a little clearer, but some of you will know there is the atomic scientists, ever since the late 40s, have set the clock, which has come to be known in popular language as the doomsday clock. And they've set it so that if ever we're getting closer to midnight on this clock, that is when Armageddon happens, midnight. So you don't want to get too close. In the 70-odd years since the end of the Second World War, the furthest away the clock has been from midnight has been 20 minutes to midnight. These are the top scientists in the world that have formed the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And at the moment, it stands at 90 seconds to midnight. It has never been closer to midnight. And I would expect that within a year, they'll set it at 60 seconds to midnight. That is a very considered judgment. They take months to reflect on it and then come out with a consensus position. I'm just giving you that as a little background. Now, the first thing I want to do is to do a couple of things in relation to the West and Russia, and then a few things in relation to the West and China, by way of background. The first is the first little clip we're going to see is the timeline of NATO's expansion from the time that it was formed in the 1940s. We've got to pay close attention to this because that is what has driven Russia absolutely mad. Okay, so there we go. You're looking at the year and you're looking at the map and you're looking at what's happening to the navy blue. Watching the year and navy blue. Did you see the Turkey joining? And then Germany. Understand what Russia's saying. It's been saying it for a long time. Enough is enough. It stops here. Red line. No more. Of course, it doesn't always work the way they want. But that's what it's been saying. And anyhow, so just next slide, next slide, yes. Just to give you an idea of the area beyond NATO, the world, the United States has 750 military bases outside of the United States, 750, and just over 170,000 troops around the world in countries other than the United States. There's nothing like that Russia or China can even begin to equal. They've got nothing like that. And you can see that it covers all continents. Heavy concentration, of course, in Europe, and quite a heavy concentration in East Asia. Africa is a little bit misleading. You see a lot of red dots, but they're relatively small numbers. The big numbers are in Europe and East Asia. Next slide. Well, there you are. Bases and where they are, and troops and where they are. And you can see very clearly that the three key ones are the two in East Asia, Japan and Korea, and the other one, Germany, and to a lesser extent, Italy. And of course, one's aiming at Russia and the other one's aiming at China. Now, when we come to nuclear warheads, we need to get our minds around this because they're now, next slide, they're now the talk of the town. Things went quiet for about 10 to 15 years, and gradually the heat has come up again on the nuclear question. So there are two countries that dominate the nuclear arsenals, their nuclear arsenals, the US and Russia. Of those 5.5 or 6, between them, 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, and of course, by far the most lethal, the most precise, the most accurate. Should 5% of those nuclear weapons at the disposal of the US and Russia ever be used, 5%, it would be the end of the planet for most living species. 5% is enough. And who would be foolish enough to use only 5%? When you are on the losing side, you will try and retrieve as far so it will go. If it ever starts, it won't finish at 5%. And as you know, Russia's been saying, you cross another red line, that's it. And in these matters, one does not bluff. That's one of the cardinal rules of nuclear deterrence. You don't bluff, because if you bluff, your bluff will be called, and then you're nowhere. And that's why it is now so dangerous. One miscalculation around the Ukraine, and that's it. One American soldier gets shot in the Ukraine by Russian forces. What happens? The United States has to retaliate. They're delivering massive volumes of lethal aid to Ukraine. I suspect they're doing it or with second and third parties doing the carrying. But should there be one American who gets shot? Miscalculation. Next slide. Let us now look at China. Different kettle of fish altogether to Russia. Very different. Hasn't got a significant nuclear capability. It's comparable to that of France and the UK. And we're going to get just a little, China's rise is economic rise. Doesn't waste its effort and energies on me. It's too clever for that. Economic rise, we're going to see that. Oh, oh yes, yes. Okay. Right. Extraordinary. The most remarkable period of economic growth by any country in human history. By such a margin, whoever comes number two is irrelevant. It has never been done before and probably never will again. It's just too extraordinary to contemplate in this short space of time. China has done for 1,400 million people what Britain did for 30 million in a quarter of the time. The British Great Industrial Revolution, a quarter of the time for a population that's 40 times greater. 800 million lifted out of poverty within 30 years. Right. Next slide, I think, is the, yes. Now, we're going to see one of the world's leading experts, a snippet of his presentation. Some of you may have heard of him, Martin Jacques, and as you can see, a leading scholar in UK, American, and Chinese universities. And he is probably, I don't know, probably in the Western world, the world's bestseller on China. His books go into the hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Okay, we're going to hear a snippet from him, about 8 minutes. It should be interesting.
The idea that America is number one is part of the American DNA. It's not just the presidents and the congressmen and so on who believe this. This is deeply imbued, I think, in the average American. The Americans think they're best. The Americans think they have to be top dogs. They're not going to be bossed around by anyone else. They're not going to be rivaled by anyone else. Now, of course, the reality is rather different, historically speaking, because no country can ever expect to be number one forever. Think of China, the century of humiliation. China was displaced. And so this was the case with Britain and so on. And this will be the case with the United States. America's relative economic decline probably starts around the 1980s. But the Americans have basically been in denial of this. Even to this day, they're largely in denial. It would be suicide for an American president to say, we are in decline and we cannot change that situation. We have to accommodate ourselves to a new world. Americans are not ready for this kind of argument. So what was the American response to China as a threat? Essentially, the American response was an assault against China, to find a way of making China's rise more difficult, to prevent China's rise if possible, if not at least obstruct China's rise. And so, after Trump becomes president, you see after a short while the beginning of the trade war. And then after the trade war, or alongside the trade war, the tech war. And steadily, as the acrimonious and abrasive approach to China developed, you see action being taken against China on all sorts of different fronts. I would argue now, I think probably it would be appropriate to call the situation that the world is now in and the relationship between the United States and China as a new Cold War. But just because we use the term Cold War doesn't mean we should confuse or conflate this Cold War with the one between the United States and the Soviet Union. There are three fundamental differences between them. The first is that the United States and the Soviet Union lived and occupied two entirely different economic worlds. Never the twain shall meet. They just had two different international systems, one belonging to the United States, the other to the Soviet Union. Now, of course, this is not the situation with China. China is hugely integrated with the global economy. Indeed, I would argue that in some respects it's more integrated with the global economy than is true of the United States. I mean, take for one thing trade. I mean, China is a much more important trading nation, exporting and importing, than the United States. Now, whatever the Americans say, whatever the Trump administration would like to do, they will not be able to excise China from the global economy. They can go about it, but they won't get that far, in my view. They can't take, as it were, take China out of the global economy. It is simply too important. It is too integrated. Its relations with so many countries around the world are too advanced for that to happen. My second point is the Soviet Union was never an economic peer or equal of the United States. At most, it had maybe accounted for maybe 60% the size of the American economy. Probably less, probably more like half. Now, you cannot say that of China. China already in 2014, as we've seen, had overtaken the size of the American economy measured by primary purchasing power, GDP. Now, it is generally expected that within the next few years, maybe 5 years, depends partly on the impact of the pandemic, that China will overtake the United States by the other measure of GDP, which is in dollar terms. And if we extend the time horizon a bit further, you'll see the picture of the global economy by roughly 2030. Now, all these figures are obviously projections, so they're obviously, they're not facts. But you'll see, it gives you some idea that by 2030, China could account, this is by PPP, GDP, PPP, could account for 1/3 of global GDP. By which time it will be something like twice the size of the American economy. Already by this measure, by the way, it is 20% bigger than the American economy. And you'll see also that even when you combine the American economy and the EU, China will be larger than both put together. So, the rise of China economically is formidable. And it is deeply embedded, and it is showing its ability to perform in many different areas, including, of course, technology. The third point I would make is that the Soviet Union made a fundamental mistake in its relationship with the United States, and that was the arms race. It tried to compete militarily with the United States, and it's spent so much money, wasted such resources in a disastrous approach. China won't make that mistake. China won't make that mistake for two reasons. One, China doesn't emphasize the military in a way that, for example, the United States does or the Soviet Union did. And so China's approach is much more the importance, the fundamental importance of the economic. I think the prospect is that we are looking at this kind of situation we've got now, the Cold War and antagonistic relationship between the United States and China for the foreseeable future. And it's impossible to predict how long. But you can say, or I would argue, that the condition for a change in this antagonism depends on a shift in the American position. You see, the Americans are insisting that they should enjoy sole primacy in the world. And this is no longer possible. This atmosphere and relationship will change is the moment when the United States comes to the view that it must share primacy in the world with China. And that will be the precondition for, I think, a new turn in the relationship between the United States and China.
Okay, now we risk going so just one more thing, the next slide, to demonstrate the difference between the United States and China, the handling of COVID. This is an extraordinary story. Coming? Okay. These figures are as of Monday, yesterday. They're updated every day. And I've rounded them off to the nearest 1,000 for simplicity. So far, as we speak today, the United States has reached 1 million COVID deaths. 1 million. More than all the wars it's been engaged in since World War II in deaths, just COVID. And then you see UK and Australia. And then if you look how many deaths per 1,000 of the population, 3 for every 1,000 Americans has died through COVID. 2.62 people in Britain, 0.3 in Australia, and 0.01 in China, 300 times better than the United States. And don't let anyone tell you Shanghai's problem. Yes, of course, lockdown. Lockdown, 24 million, 6 hours in which to do it. You need 3 hospitals, 2,000 beds each, 10 days, it's done. No messing around. There's no messing around. The organizational skill is extraordinary, unmatched anywhere in the world, unmatched. Because it's not just resources or people. It's how to put them together. This skill, that skill, that skill, that skill in the required number quickly. China can do it. Some of the things it does we don't like. That's okay. But we just need to understand where things are at. So this might give us a bit of background. It's not much, but it's a little bit. And perhaps we can pose some difficult questions to our 2 speakers in a little while. Geoff Raby, who was the former ambassador to China, one of the most distinguished Australian ambassadors to China, some 10 years ago now, or nearly. And Dr. Gromyko, who heads the Institute for Europe of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Okay, now we're going to join in discussion around our respective groups. So our online participants will break into their groups, and we'll have the next slide, please. 3 simple questions for all of you. They're I questions. Please answer the question, not the question you would have liked to have got but didn't get, the question that's there, please, because that makes for a proper discussion between everyone. So the first one, how closely have I been following the tensions between these 3 major centers of power in the world? How closely? Up to you to say. I don't know, but you should know. Second question, once you've gone around, each one having a go at answering question one, in terms of knowing, let alone understanding what's going on between these three, what do I rely on as my sources of information? Just share that with everyone. And three, we ask you to reflect. Do you think the sources of information on which you rely for this purpose, not for 10 other purposes, following COVID or climate change, no, this one, US-China Russia relations, do you think they give you a reasonably objective picture of what's going on and why it is happening? So please. Now we've got 15, 17 minutes. So crisp answers to each question. No long monologues, crisp answers to each question. The first two are factual, the third one, a bit of a reflection. Thank you.
Do you want to go first? Yeah.
Dr. Gromyko,
Hello, Professor Camilleri.
how are you?
Thank you. I'm fine. How are you?
Very well.
That's great. That's great. I am looking forward to our discussion moderated by you.
Thank you. I'm looking forward. Everyone here is looking forward to that. Now, we haven't yet got our other guest. We'll give him 1 or 2 minutes. I was planning to start with him, but if he's not here in the next couple of minutes, we'll start with you. Is that all right with
Okay.
you?
Okay, no problem. Sure.
What weather do you have in Moscow?
Well, today it's quite rainy, but quite warm, plus 16 or 17, something like that.
Exactly, that's Melbourne's weather.
This is not usual for Moscow to have such a cool May, but what we can do.
Fair enough. Is Geoff with us?
Hi, can you hear me?
Hello, Geoff. How are you?
Good, thank you. It's a warm day in Paris. It's a very warm day.
Is it? Okay. Well, not in Melbourne.
Uh,
But it's hot at University College, which is where we're at. And I'm not sure where everyone else online, where they are, or different temperatures, no doubt. All right, let me get things moving. We're delighted, we're privileged to have you both, Dr. Geoff Raby and Dr. Alexey Gromyko. I will briefly introduce each one in turn. We've arranged it so that Geoff Raby will speak first, and then we'll have Dr. Gromyko. Just a word of introduction about Geoff Raby. He was Australia's ambassador to China 2007 to 2011. He has many achievements to his name. I won't list them all. He was named Friendship Ambassador to Shandong Province, honorary citizen of Chengdu City, and is the author of a widely acclaimed book, China's Grand Strategy and Australia's Future in the New Global Order. It is really quite a remarkable book, published by Melbourne University Press. I so happen to be on the advisory board of MUP, and we have greatly valued the contribution of what has turned out to be, for MUP, a bestseller. Dr. Raby is very well placed, has written extensively on many things. He is, I mention it because it's also my university, an alumni, distinguished alumnus of La Trobe University. He has extraordinary knowledge and insight into contemporary China, and we would very much like you to address us for a little while. Then I'll ask Dr. Gromyko to do the same. I'll then engage you both in a short conversation with a few questions basically to the two of you, and then we'll open it up to questions from both our online participants and those here attending in person. So Geoff, would you like to start things off and tell us how you see China and China's relations with the West generally, the United States, Australia, and other parts of the Western world, how you think the relationship is moving or not moving? Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe, for inviting me into this this discussion. I'm delighted to be here, and of course, for full disclosure, Joe Camilleri was one of my lecturers when I was at university as an undergraduate in politics, and for whom I remain very grateful to this day for his great teaching and insights and scholarship. Well, it's a big subject, and I thought I'd maybe make a few overarching observations to maybe set the framework, but a lot's happened, as we all know, in the last few months as well, which challenges a lot of conventional wisdom. Clearly, what we're seeing, and it's been progressing for some time, but in the nature of global events seems to be accelerating quite unexpectedly, is a major struggle over the shape of the New World Order. We'd all agree, I'm sure, that the unipolar moment of the post-Cold War period is long finished. We've been in a multipolar order of some sort without a lot of stability for some time, and it's been taking shape, and people are focused very much on China as the ascendant power, challenging the US as the dominant power. The US went through a very fundamental reassessment and change in its foreign policy with respect to China, and of course, for a country like Australia, so closely aligned to the US, it's had profound implications for Australia and its own relations with China, which are in the worst state they've been in since diplomatic relations were established 50 years ago this year. The US basically changed its assessment from China as from one of trying to accommodate and integrate China into the international system, to one of seeing China as a challenge and a threat to the system. So from being, if you like, a constructive participant in the system, the US increasingly view China as a revisionist power. And obviously there's some truth to that, and China has clearly decided that whilst it will continue to influence and shape the international order, it wants to do so in ways that reflect its own interests, which is obviously perfectly understandable. But the US has taken a view that China has shifted from being a constructive partner or participant to one of a strategic competitor. And that view has developed and firmed up and strengthened in Washington over the past 6 years or so. At the same time in China, under Xi Jinping, the political regime has become more and more authoritarian, increasingly ideology, propaganda, and repression becoming commonplace, as well as a cult of a personality that's been built up around Xi Jinping. And a big part of this cult of the personality is that Xi is standing up for Australia. It's wrapped up in for China rather. It's wrapped up in nationalism, and there's a narrative that's formed which is very hostile to the West, an anti-Western narrative. We're seeing that continuing to gain strength, and it suits Xi Jinping's own domestic political purposes. And of course, this year is an extremely important year in that in October or November there will be the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party, and at the 19th Party Congress 5 years ago, Xi Jinping changed the constitution to remove fixed terms on the president. And so there is a very pronounced political contest underway in China over the question of whether Xi will continue in his current role with all the current powers that he has. And there are many permutations and combinations around that, although clearly everyone basically believes he will continue. But I think we should talk about this at some stage, because the political internal dynamics in China is playing out in the foreign policy space. But as I argue in my book, with the shift in US view of China from a cooperative relationship to a competitive relationship, for countries like Australia, they've been put in a very difficult position of having to make choices. And we've seen the leaders of ASEAN in Washington last week, although with very little outcomes, it seems. But no one in the Asian region really wants to be having to make choices in this power struggle, if you like, between the US and China. But Australia has sort of voluntarily made that choice and has basically glued itself to the hip of the United States. And the implications of that for Australia and regional security are profound, not least in seen or reflected in the decision on having nuclear-powered submarines. So we're in a very, very fluid situation. The global system, the order, is in a very, very fluid situation. And that fluidity, I think, has been massively compounded by Russian invasion of Ukraine. China's role in this is very interesting because China, along with India and others, could have taken a more critical position. In fact, China should have taken a more critical position because fundamental to China's foreign policy stance is non-intervention in other countries. And with Xi Jinping's failure to condemn the invasion, he's effectively undermine a major tenet of China's foreign policy, for which I think he will be under quite a lot of internal criticism within China. Why did all this happen in China? Why Xi took the position that he took and so on? I really think he has very much become part of this, or is leading this strong anti-Western narrative in China that sees China itself looking at decoupling from the West, becoming more autarkic, and seeking allies and alliances elsewhere. So what does I'll stop at this point, I think, Joe. But what does this new order that may be emerging look like? I'm very much influenced by Mearsheimer's notion of bounded orders. So rather than, obviously it's gone, a unipolar order, multiple orders involving groups of countries. And I think what we're seeing, and the recent events, I think, really reinforce that and accelerate the trends, is two bounded orders emerging. One led and associated with and around the United States, where countries like Australia clearly have made very firm and unequivocal choices to be part of that order, despite the economic cost of doing so. And an order around China and led by China, which is essentially a Eurasian order. How Russia fits into that order is an interesting question, because China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, through its just great economic weight and its geographical position, has extended enormous influence across Eurasia, to the extent that it can be seen already as the dominant power, and that will only become more so. But I think ultimately this goes and runs up against Russia's own view of itself and its own security needs. And I think the China order, if you like, the bounded order of China, is potentially very unstable within Eurasia. And I don't think the current China-Russia friendship of convenience, as I call it, is durable. How this, to your question about war in this talk, how all this emerges is a big unknown. Whilst Mearsheimer would argue that conflict between the leading powers is inevitable and will inevitably lead to war, and he wrote all this long before Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think that there is a more optimistic view that could be taken, and that is that the pressures and needs for cooperation between the bounded orders will prevail over the risks and threats of conflict. And I, for one, think that we still enjoy, if you like, if that's the right word, a high measure of security because of the existence of nuclear weapons, because of MAD. And I think that will make it very unlikely that the US and China will find themselves in direct conflict, and more likely that they will be exploring ways in which these bounded orders will cooperate. So, Joe, that's a sort of slightly happier, uplifting note to finish on, but I hope those remarks stimulate some conversation.
Thanks very much, Geoff. Now, if we can turn to Dr. Gromyko. He's the director of the Institute of Europe at Russian Academy of Sciences. He lectures at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. He's the co-founder of the Russian movement, Support for a Democratic Global Order and for the United Nations. And he's the author of countless academic papers. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. And I pass on to you the microphone, so to speak. Please share your insights with us, Dr. Gromyko.
Chair, thank you very much. I am privileged to take part in this seminar, and let me try to share my views with you in 10 minutes. Well, the Ukrainian crisis, which started in 2014, is interpreted in Russia, if to boil it down, as a leverage for the United States to sustain its influence in Europe and beyond. No doubt, the Ukrainian crisis is a very important piece of the European security puzzle, but it is not its core. It is a consequence of the problems which we have in relations between Russia and the West. Just to recall that the essence of the Russian initiatives on the security guarantees put forward in December 2021 was focused on conceptual issues of European security. Without common vision of principles and tenets of the European security, it would be really impossible to reach a long-lasting settlement and understanding. Existing documents and agreements, most of them are under the umbrella of the OSCE, such as, for example, the Vienna document 2011, are quite sufficient as instruments to solve problems of lower technical level or order. And even the adopted CFE, which now has not been functioning for many years, de facto has not been breached by either side in terms of levels and ceilings of different classical systems of weaponry. Most problems which we have now in the sphere of European security, this is my view, originate not in discrepancies of the arms control system or confidence building measures, but in reneging on some fundamentals. And basically, there are two of them: the expansion, the enlargement of NATO, and different readings of the indivisibility of security, the principle of the indivisibility of security. The events in August 2008 in Georgia and in February 2014 and afterward in Ukraine, from my point of view, happened exactly because Russia and the West approached the principles of European security in different and often opposite ways. Just to recall that NATO decided in the middle of the 90s that its interpretation of security would rely exclusively on the concept of the open door policy. In other words, if any European state has a right to submit its application to join NATO, and if certain requirements are met, then the alliance must satisfy its wish. The problem of expansion, to my mind, would not have appeared at all had the West followed the example of the Soviet Union and then Russia in the end of the 80s, in the beginning of the 90s, in abandoning the pattern of the Cold War, which created two military blocs, the Warsaw Pact and NATO. And at that time, the hope was that after the USSR and the West proclaimed the end of the Cold War, the military structures which emerged from it would be disbanded and the European security would be based on the OSCE mechanisms. Well, the Warsaw Pact disappeared. The hard security component of the OSCE in the course of time was marginalized, and NATO was moving fast to include all the countries between itself and Russia. By the way, Saakashvili decided to bomb Tsinvali only because he was under the impression that his country was on the verge of joining NATO, and that if Russia responded to his provocation, NATO would move in. Ukraine's membership in NATO got the green light together with Georgia at the Bucharest summit in 2009. The two states did not get a status of a candidate country, but NATO declared that they will join. It is said in the document that they will join NATO. Well, in 2022, confrontation between Russia and the West has entered, of course, a new ideological, economic, and military stage. And the US narrative of the world divided into authoritarian regimes and democracies, when the former ostensibly threatened the latter, to my mind, makes the situation only worse. The current international relations, of course, differ significantly from the bipolar world post-1945, when cooperation, especially after the Cuban crisis in the 60s, in the 70s, was balanced by competition, and when there was a backdoor to manage confrontation through dialogue, arms control, and military de-escalation. Nowadays, from the Moscow's point of view, the paradigm of the West-centered world order does not envisage and provide equal and mutually beneficial interaction. And for example, if to judge from the European Union Strategic Compass, recently published, we see in what direction, the strategic thinking is moving in the European Union. And also, in my opinion, it is predetermined that Russia in the new NATO strategy, which will be approved in Madrid in June this year, Russia will be defined as the main immediate threat to the European Union, and China as a systemic long-term rival. Nowadays, even the very cooperation between Russia and Belarus, or between Russia and China, are considered in the United States, in the European Union, to be destabilizing per se. Of course, because of Ukraine, nowadays we have a poisonous bitterness between Russia and the European Union. Unfortunately, for the first time in its history, the European Union is sending lethal weapons to a zone of military conflict. The quality of sanctions against Russia is unparalleled in history, and I am afraid that regardless of how the events in Ukraine unfold, a substantial economic and trade disengagement and decoupling between Russia and the European Union will go on. And it will go in parallel with the further technological and political decoupling between the United States and some of its European partners with China. And at the same time, the ties between Moscow and Beijing will continue to grow. And in conclusion, I would like to mention that last year and this year, I have been privileged to be a member of a high-level advisory commission, which contributed to the publication of the report on Common Security 2022. This project was organized by the Olof Palme Center and the International Peace Bureau. And just to recall that the first Common Security Report was issued 40 years ago in 1982 by the Olof Palme Commission. Not all the views in the 2022 report reflect my opinion, but I support most of it, especially the 6 common security principles. And basically, with all profound changes, which we have experienced since 1982, the meaning is the same: the prevention of a new major war and the peace settlement of disputes and conflicts. And also, I would like to draw one telling example that according to CIPRI, in 2021, the world military expenditure for the first time in history exceeded $2 trillion. In nominal terms, it rose by 6.1%. And 2021 became the 7th year in a row of a constant increase in military spending. And by the way, some people interpret it as a glass being half full, not half empty. And one may point out that this spending share in the world GDP is 2.2%, and that this share is less in 2021 than in 2020 in relative terms. But from my point of view, this is a sheer complacency, and there are many reasons for that. For example, these spendings are highly concentrated, and more than 60% of the spendings is generated by just 6 countries. And of course, the United States dwarfs all the others with a staggering $800 billion defense budget. And it is followed by China, then India, the UK, and then Russia. But just to conclude, I think that one of the main concerns should be that the sphere of arms control and confidence building measures, the whole mechanism which we inherited from the Cold War of the international and bilateral agreements, these mechanisms are dilapidated. For example, the ABM treaty is buried, the CFE treaty is dead, the INF treaty is abandoned, and the Open Skies treaty these days is on its deathbed. And even the critically important New START treaty, which was prolonged by Moscow and Washington last year, may turn out to be the last of the Mohicans. So still, in spite of what I have said and mentioned, I am a moderate optimist, and history teaches us that diplomacy, conventional wisdom, and, well, better sides of human nature have been able to overcome most dramatic challenges in human history, including numerous regional conflicts, and of course the prevention of a new world war since 1945. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. Well, now for the next half hour or so, first, I will ask both of you some questions, trying to draw you out on some of the things you've been saying. And after 10, 15 minutes, we'll open it up, to people here to ask questions. The procedure will be as in the past. Those who are online, please put your questions in the chat box. Pithy questions, not too long, and we will follow the chat box and pick out 2 or 3 questions, and similarly, we'll get 2 or 3 questions if we have time from those who are here physically present. And for those who are physically present, please come to the lectern so that everyone can hear you, not just here, but online. Okay, Geoff, can I start by posing a question to you? You didn't say anything much about what people consider 2 potential flashpoints in the Asia-Pacific region, namely the South China Sea and Taiwan. Do you see them as emerging flashpoints over the next 10 years or so? Or do you think we'll ride them out fairly comfortably at the end of the day? How do you see it?
Thanks, Joe. Yes, thanks for raising those points. Yeah, look, I think the South China Sea is pretty much resolved, and what we see is something of a equilibrium there now. The aggressive position of the US and Australia, the talk of blocking sea lanes and everything, I think is seen for what it is. And clearly, China has an enormous interest in making sure the opposite happens, that the sea lanes remain open. China's now engaged in bilateral and plurilateral dialogue with states who are directly affected by its behaviour in the South China Sea. And I think the militaries in the region pretty much think there's little can be done about it. So I don't see that rearing up again as a flashpoint that could potentially lead to conflict. Taiwan, of course, is a different situation. Very, very different. It's Chinese sovereign territory. It's acknowledged. China's claims are recognised, if not acknowledged, but they're certainly recognised as being there. And Chinese leadership for a very long time has made it clear that if there was any move towards unilateral declaration of independence, China would have no option but to exercise a military one and take military action. But that has been a fairly stable status quo, despite all the rhetoric around it, for a long time. And we've had periods of heightened tension and lesser tension across the Taiwan Straits. When I first went to Beijing as ambassador in 2007, then everybody was believing that war was imminent over Taiwan. And then you had the period in '96 when China rather carelessly fired some missiles into the Straits of Taiwan, and the US sailed 2 carrier fleets through the Straits of Taiwan, and tensions were ratcheted down after that. I mean, I'm very much of the same mind as Alexey when he concluded in a fairly optimistic way that essentially common sense and human instincts and so on will avoid conflict. But there's also, I think, a very substantial reason why conflict is most unlikely, despite the rhetoric, particularly the unhelpful rhetoric coming out of the Australian government and the Australian Defence Minister, and that is war between China and Taiwan is essentially a civil war. And it's very difficult to see any Chinese leader today presiding over the mass murder of Han Chinese in Taiwan. They're ethnically the same, they're Han Chinese, the language is the same, the script is different, but it's still a script that both sides understand and can read. So I think that raises the bar, if you like, against conflict, against military conflict substantially. Similarly, Taiwan itself is most unlikely to be provoked or encouraged by the US and others into declaring independence because the costs would be massive. But also just the logistics of how do you militarily occupy Taiwan and have stability there. I mean, it's just really not feasible. And we saw how with Ukraine, I think, has sent shudders through the leadership in Beijing, particularly by demonstrating just how difficult these sorts of military actions are. So, if anything, I think the Taiwan issue has become less of a flashpoint, precisely because Beijing has seen very clearly the improbability of it ever militarily taking Taiwan.
And you're saying, Geoff, that unlikely that any future Taiwanese government will unilaterally declare independence.
Yeah, I think that's very unlikely because the consequences are understood, and the problem on Taiwan is this really, and it's a big problem for Beijing. Whereas previous generations in Taiwan always saw reunification with the motherland as the natural endpoint. Obviously, reunification on the KMT's terms, not the Communist Party's terms, but reunification, and saw mainland China as their home, their emotional home. Now there's a whole generation of young people that think of Taiwan rather, quite independently of the mainland and don't relate to the mainland. And therein is a big problem. I don't think it leads to a unilateral declaration of independence, but it makes Beijing's task immensely more difficult because basically the population of Taiwan has no interest in reuniting with the mainland at any time.
If I can turn to you, Dr. Gromyko, of course you have a particular interest in Europe. Do you think once this Ukraine issue, there is at least a cessation of hostilities in some time, that Western European countries, and I'm thinking particularly France, Germany, would be interested in renewing a more stable relationship with Russia? I'm thinking especially of French President Macron, who spent so many hours in discussions with President Putin. One must assume that he saw an interest, both of them saw an interest in doing that, in maintaining a reasonable relationship. So post-Ukraine conflict, military conflict, do you see the possibility of some renewal of the relationship, but in particular with those Western European countries and Russia? How do you see the relationship?
Thank you for your question. Europe for centuries was a territory of many hundreds of conflicts. Europe was the epicenter of two world wars. That was Europe, not Africa or Asia, but Europe. Such countries as Germany and France tried not once to destroy each other. There is a certain issue of a tyranny of history, a tyranny of culture, a tyranny of geography. So we are bound to be neighbors for the following years and centuries. And of course, sooner or later, a new military conflict, the ongoing conflict in Europe, is going to end, and then the political process and diplomacy will come to the fore. And just to recall that since the first days of the military conflict, starting from the 24th of February, almost immediately Russian diplomats started their meetings with their counterparts from Ukraine. They held 3 rounds of talks in Belarus, and then the most important one, the 4th round in Istanbul. And we were getting some quite positive news from the open sources saying that on several even most difficult points, the delegations were converging. Well, but since then, a lot has happened, and you remember how Mr. Borrell proclaimed that the fate of this conflict should be or will be decided on the ground by force. It was very strange to hear that from a top US diplomat. Like I mentioned in my short talk, the European Union, for the first time in its history, started sending weapons and lethal weapons to a zone of military conflict. Now we have a lot of signals from not from the United States, from Europe, that there are quite many numerous players who would be interested in prolonging this war as far as possible, and of course this atmosphere is not very favorable for pushing both sides, not just Moscow but Kiev, to seriously discussing and continuing their efforts in the diplomatic and political dimension. As to your question on at least major European powers like France and Germany and Italy, for example, Spain, and why not to mention the United Kingdom? Well, from my point of view, all of these major states and Russia including will have to repair to a maximum possible extent their relationships. We live, you know, in one region, in one continent. Our cultural and human and economic and political contacts are too dense, you know. This is not something from the blue, but the legacy of many hundreds of years. Nobody is interested in military destabilization in Europe for years. Well, there are some voices which are calling, you know, for military solution of some problems, not between Russia and Ukraine, but between Russia and the West. But I think that if to discuss these problems rationally, then of course all sides, all those European capitals, which still has a capacity to have and pursue the strategic thinking, should have in mind a key problem of how to create at last, sooner or later, a stable architecture of security in Europe. And all of us know perfectly well that without Russia, without Germany, without France, without United Kingdom, without Italy, and of course without some or all other medium-sized or smaller states, it would be impossible to do so. But we need sooner or later to come back to those basics, you know, which were embedded in the Helsinki Final Act in 1972, in the Paris Charter in 1990, and so on and so forth. If we don't want to have Europe for many years to come, a territory of constant and deepening escalation, which is quite a probable scenario. It is not just because of Ukraine, but because of what may happen with the security of Kaliningrad region, what may happen, with the security in the Black Sea region. There are a lot of issues which may dwarf in the foreseeable future the problems which we have because of the Ukrainian crisis. So better to work on stopping, the spiral of escalation, than trying to put our stakes, to put all eggs in the basket of total decoupling and total hybrid war.
Thank you. Now, we may have some questions. I hope we do. Has anyone who's been following the chat box? Jane, are there some questions?
Yes, there are.
Yeah, please come here near the lectern. Yes.
Can you hear me from here?
Yes.
Okay. How many of these do you want me to go
Well,
through?
give us a couple to begin with.
Alrighty, so to Dr. Raby, are there any arguments that can be used to promote greater scrutiny of the Australia-US alliance, and whose interest it serves that might help?
Oh, there may have been, but I increasingly fear the time for that has passed. This election we're having in Australia, for those who are not up to date with it or following it, will take place this Saturday. The opposition has made it a cornerstone of its foreign policy to have no difference with the government on any aspect of foreign policy, and especially the Australia-US alliance. And those of us who have tried to argue for a more critical approach and to suggest Australia should be pursuing an independent foreign policy really have had no traction at all in the discussion. So there are many strong arguments for Australia to have an independent foreign policy like most other countries, but it's so drowned out by the US alliance voices that it's very, very difficult to see how things are going to change. And
in the near future.
Sorry?
In the near future.
Near future, yeah.
Okay, do you want me to ask one from
Another one?
Dr. Gromyko?
If there is one.
Okay, so Dr. Gromyko, if we could, how could we go about repairing the relationship between US and Russia? Just a small one for you.
Thank you for a very easy question. I think that Moscow and Washington should follow what they did in June last year in Geneva 2021, Geneva summit. They should continue their tracks of consultations on the future of strategic stability. The time is flying fast. The New START is going to function just for the next 4 years. This is a very short period for serious negotiations on the future of strategic stability, which is complicated hugely by disruptive technologies, by the cyber factor, by what China is doing with its strategic systems. But this strategic dialogue should go on. Then besides the future of strategic stability, there is a very serious problems in how diplomacy is functioning between Russia and the United States. There are a lot of hurdles. A lot of diplomats on both sides have been sent back home due to difficulties and quarrels. That should be somehow drastically improved if two military superpowers want in the foreseeable future to have a stable and secure channels and tracks of a serious dialogue. Unfortunately, the United States decided to abandon the track on cyber dialogue. Let's hope that they will change their mind when the Ukrainian crisis, its military stage, is a thing of the past. And just to finish my reply, it seems to me that main problems are not in the mind of Russian politicians and diplomats, but in the United States. Now we have a bulletproof bipartisan consensus in the United States on Russia. It is very difficult to see how the political establishment, how the political class in Washington would like to improve the situation in the sphere of arms race and confidence building measures, how they are going to deal both with Russia and China, if they want to see them both strategically as rivals. Does Washington think that to have both Moscow and Beijing as its rival, both political and ideological and economic and military, is a good strategy for years and decades to come? From my point of view, such kind of strategy would be very vulnerable. There are dozens of very difficult problems in the domestic development of the United States. We will see in November this year what is going to happen as a result of the midterm elections. Basically, Russia and Washington should be true to the legacy of the United States and Soviet Union in the 60s, in the 70s, when the strategic parity, the very notion of strategic stability was reached due to the systemic efforts both by Moscow and Washington. So to have a strategy of many months and many years of pursuing and leading some proxy wars in economic sphere, in the sphere of hard security. From my point of view, that would be a disastrous strategy both for Washington and Moscow.
Okay. Now, do we have some questions here in the room? Don't all rush. Any questions? I can't see. Yes, John. Come here, please. Let's see how we got the time.
Professor, hi, my name's John. I was just wondering if you could clarify for us the qualitative difference between the decision around Ukraine and various individual European countries sending weapons sales to other parts of the world. where they may be involved in conflicts. You just said this was the first time that the EU in history had agreed to send weapons to conflict. And yet they've got major arms suppliers as member countries of the EU. Does the EU have to agree together that any particular one country is allowed to export to a conflict zone overseas, like in Saudi Arabia, the Yemen war or something like that? I realise there might be constraints, like in Australia, well, we've exported missiles to Saudi Arabia that are then used in Yemen, and there's been a lot of concern about that and lobbying. And we've got a policy of supposedly not sending weapons to where there could be human rights abuses being very obviously committed by the party or the government. I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit more the politics and the agreements on that.
This is a fact of life that for the first time in its history, the European Union, not individual European countries, member states of the European Union, but the EU as a whole, has taken a decision to supply lethal weapons to the zone of military conflict. And by the way, this is done on the basis of the budget of the instrument, which is called the Fund of Peace, the instrument of peace. So this is a bit strange and absurd when by now more than 1.5 billion euros have been spent from the Peace Fund on sending lethal weapons to a war zone. As to individual member states of the European Union, as far as I know, most of them have had very strict rules of what kind of weaponry, what kind of weapons and arms can or cannot be sent to other countries. For example, Germany, until recently, had a very strict legal rules what kind of weaponry it can supply, or what weaponry can third countries using German weaponry can supply. But these days, all these rules are almost abandoned, and this is a very, from my point of view, a very irrational thing to do, because if you want to help, to end a certain military crisis, no matter where it takes place, in Europe or in Africa or in Asia, then you should try to push the sides which are direct rivals in this military conflict to come to a peace settlement as soon as possible. The United States, for example, since 1979, tried to do whatever it was possible to prolong the conflict in Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was, a side in the Vietnam War. It was helping military, including military, the Viet Cong. But in the end, that was the Soviet Union who helped the United States to end the Vietnam War. There were a lot of consultations between the Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko and Kissinger how to do that. So in the final years of the Vietnam War, the USSR was helping the United States to find a face-saving solution between Washington with Vietnam. Now we have a situation when both the European Union and the United States, plus the United Kingdom, seem to be, inclined to prolong this conflict, not to help both Kiev, Moscow to find a solution. And just to finish with saying that one of the fundamental reasons for the military phase of this conflict in Ukraine were not just problems between Moscow and Kiev, but one of the fundamentals was in the relationship between Russia on the one side and NATO on the other. So for NATO,
Gromyko, we're running a bit out of time, so can I get you to complete
just
your
to finish that both for NATO, for the United States to pretend that this conflict has nothing to do with the broader framework of interaction between Russia, NATO, the United States, from my point of view, is a disservice for this very dramatic military situation.
Thank you. Is there a question for Dr. Raby, Geoff Raby, on relating to China? Anyone, please? Oh, good. Let's have it.
Okay, so to Dr. Raby, has China always been focused on domination, or is this part of a Western narrative? Was there ever a time where China could have grown and be seen as friendly rather than a threat? And is it possible to turn things around? Another easy one.
Yeah, but it's an excellent question because it goes to the heart of so many issues. I think China's been seen as a threat only in recent years, because China was very poor, inward-looking, and really didn't have the capacity to threaten. If you read Henry Kissinger's book on China, it's called, at the end he concludes, and he wrote it about 20 years ago, I think now from memory, but he concludes that China has never been an expansionary power and should continue to be treated as such. And I found that a very odd way to finish the book, because an assertion about a country's future behaviour is not a basis for national security. Maybe he was just in a hurry to finish the book. But when you think about it, China has been both expansionary and not expansionary. Under the Ming Dynasty, they definitely weren't. It wasn't an expansionary country at all. It lived within its borders. But the Manchu were extremely expansionary, expanded China's borders up into what's now Russian Far East, all of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, or most of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on. But then the riposte to that is that, the Manchu were not Han. Manchu were Qing. They were from Manchuria. They're Mongolians, essentially, not Han Chinese. So there's no way to answer the question, really, is China expansionary or not? What I try and do in my book, though, is put that question to one side and say, if China wished to be expansionary, what can it do? And I think there is an extremely important notion which we need to be very focused on in developing our own security towards China and about China and the US. And China I describe as Prometheus bound in the book. It's a constrained superpower. It's constrained by its geography, 14 countries on its border, 22,000 kilometers of land border, and most of those borders have been hostile. It's still an empire with unresolved territory inside its borders, think Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan and now Hong Kong. But the main thing is China is constrained by its utter dependence on world markets for everything it needs to keep the economy going. And this is a very, very, very recent thing. Up until the mid-90s, China was self-sufficient in crude oil. China's a very rich country in terms of natural endowments. It just happens that there's a lot of them, and that didn't matter because for so long they were poor. But from the late 1990s, they became richer and richer, and then became utterly dependent on world markets. All of that stuff basically goes through the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea, which the US can shut in a heartbeat because of its naval preponderance. The Belt and Road Initiative really was about trying to open up new sources of supply to Russia, Central Asia, across Burma, in order to, and through Pakistan, in order to reduce China's strategic vulnerability, which is massive, a massive vulnerability on the Straits of Malacca and the South China Sea, and it will never be entirely removed. So the answer is, whatever China may wish to do, how it thinks about itself, whatever its history was, the question for strategic policy today is what's China's capacity to project power? And I think it is very, very limited and very constrained. And that's why I write a lot about the so-called China threat as being without context or proportionality. You can see a China threat everywhere, but how important is it? How much will it change? And what's the context and what's the scale of it? So that's my answer to the question.
Thanks very much, Geoff. Well, thank you to both of you. We have unfortunately run out of time, but we've been very indebted to both of you for your insights about the global geopolitical situation, which affects not just these three centers of power, but of course, their friends, their allies, and in fact, every part of the globe. I don't know that I'm quite as optimistic as either of you, but we'll have to wait and see. And hopefully common sense can prevail. Time will tell. But in any case, in the meantime, thank you to both of you, and we'll follow your contributions with great interest in the months and years ahead. Thank you, Dr. Gromyko and Dr.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All the best. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I think we need just a 2 or 3 minute break, to recover our energies, and then we'll go straight to it and look at the future. Yes. Yeah. So for those who are online, we will talk about the future in about 2 or 3 minutes. Hopefully an important part of this evening.
No, technically I'm fine, but I'm not doing it, wasting the day. It's terrible.
All right. Now, what I want to do is to, are we online, Ben? No. What I want to do now, and this involves everyone, whether you're online or in person, I would like you to complete this assignment, which will come up in a minute, and I'll take you through it, and I'll ask anyone if you have any questions. Of course, you can always send a question through to us in the days to come, but the more it's clearly understood, the better. And I will send what's going to go up on the slide to everyone shortly. So if we can go to slide 12. Okay. All right. So we want to finish this, and we stop there. We want to finish this by the 29th. And each and every one will send the completed assignment to the email address that we will provide you with. Okay, so what we want is very simple. We want you to have at least 3 conversations. I was going to say 10, but then people said wiser heads. 3 conversations. Preferably, yes, you'll all get this, but now I'm explaining it. Don't rely on getting it. You have to understand it now. So 3 conversations. It could be just with one other person. It could be with 2, with 3, with 4. I wouldn't recommend 20. A small group or one-to-one. 3 conversations separate. It can't be with the same persons. 3 separate conversations. Ideally, if you can, 5. It gives a better spread. You can reach more conclusions with a little bit more confidence if it's 5 rather than just 3. It could be anyone. If you have a partner, your partner. If you have a grown-up son or daughter, with them. It could be your aunt. It could be any family member, any member of your network, any member or members of your network. How you do it, it's your business. That's what's being tested. How you're going to do it. How good are you at striking conversations? So that's one of the things that's being tested. The conversation around the issue, not around the weather or the football or the National Gallery exhibition, none of those things, but around the issues must be no less than 20 minutes. No less than 20 minutes, each conversation, 3, ideally 5. And you've got a week in which to do it. And you do it quickly. You pick up the phone, the email, you can have it by Zoom, the conversation. You can do it in person. You can do it at home, in the wine bar, the pub, the coffee shop, wherever you want. Someone else's home, your home. You arrange it. You make it happen. And you're doing it for the people of Ukraine. You are, because that's going to be one of the issues. You dare not say, I can't. Huh? Would you like to swap with one of them right now? We'll send you right there. I can't. You will. You will have to do it. At least 3 conversations, nothing. So, key questions, but you're not going to bombard whoever you have the conversation. Oh, I've got 4 questions for you. Don't do that. Don't do that. I'm just saying these are the issues. See whether you can make them come up in conversation. Seamlessly, comfortably, no one put off. It requires skill. It requires a lot of skill. See what you give yourself out of 10. I'm not going to do it. 2 out of 10, -3, or 6 out of 10. It's up to you. You self-assess. How good was I at conducting these conversations respectfully, calmly, productively? I don't know. We'll find out. So you would like the person you're having the conversation with to give you some idea to everyone who's in the group, whether it's just the two of you or more, how closely, the same question you've been looking at, how closely have you been following what's happening? Does it feature much in your mind? What's going on there? Do you think it matters very much? We'll come to that. The same question as you've been discussing. Where do we get our information from about this and similar issues? How do we know what's going on? How it's unfolding? Is what's happening in Ukraine, that's the crunch question, but it's not going to be a question. You're just going to make it happen seamlessly. You're not asking a question. It'd be good to have people to open up and say, are they worried about what's going on? Well, it doesn't even cross their mind. Are they worried by what's going on? Do they see possible consequences which may not be nice beyond the Ukraine? Or it doesn't occur? No idea. That's all right. Doesn't matter what the answer, what the contribution is, but to elicit the contribution. Are they worried? Are they anxious? Is there anxiety anywhere buried deep down? Insofar as they know that it's happening. Of course, if you haven't got a clue that it's even happening, you're not going to be anxious about it. Okay. And the last bit we want to draw out is, do you think what's happening now, what's unfolding, the relationships between major centers of power will affect us in this conversation? Will it affect us in any way at all? Any way at all? Will it? Does it? Of course, the answer is clear, but it may not be clear to everyone engaged in the conversation. Not in 25 years' time, now, and in the next few weeks and months, will it affect us? Okay, so at the end of the conversation, we've had it. You may go for 2 hours, you may go for, but no less than 20 minutes. You're going to ask these questions. Click. In point form, not beautiful sentences. We haven't got time for beautiful sentences, just dot points. How did the conversation go? Terribly? Well? You're happy with it? You're not happy with it? Tell us. How do you see it? Was it stimulating, informative? Did the person you were talking with, listening to, did they feel good about the conversation? Or was it a bit of an ordeal? And then the key question is the third and the fourth. Key questions. The third, how well did I handle it? As a facilitator, if you like. You have to make it happen. And you had an eye on it going smoothly and well. You've had the advantage of all that we've been saying and doing and listening. That the people you'll be speaking with, conversing with, won't. If you had the conversation all over again with hindsight, would you have done anything differently? From the very beginning, when you invited someone, right at the end, would you have done anything different? And if so, what? Now, just a second, I'll be delighted to know the answers from each and every one of you, and I will share with you the overall result, not in personal terms, but the weight. The majority were very happy with the way the conversations went, etc., etc. Question. Susan.
These are very pessimistic questions.
What?
Why aren't we asking about solutions and about how do we change this? Or
Well, you can go do that too. Don't let me stop you going into other territory. But I do want just to ask, well, not really. How will it affect us? It'll make me more determined than ever to seek solutions. I want to be part of a movement that moves towards solutions. That's how it affects me. Someone might say in your group. So the affect me doesn't necessarily mean affect me badly. It could affect you well. When you say, are you worried by the turn of events? Well, if you're not worried at all, you're not going to be wanting to respond to help things along, because there's nothing to help. It's all going smoothly. So you've got to establish that. If you're suffering from ill health, you can be very positive about it, but first of all, you have to acknowledge, and the doctor has to diagnose that you are suffering from something or other and needs to be attended to. And then, by all means, but I take your point, Susan, by all means, have a discussion about positive things where to from here, by all means, yes. These are not to be followed religiously. These are just some ideas as to how the conversation, the ground that it might cover. Yes.
So you want this email to you by Sunday night, is that right?
Yeah, by Sunday evening,
Yeah.
29th of May.
You'll use the content
And the following Tuesday. So no point giving it to me Tuesday afternoon. Don't send it. Don't send it. I won't be looking at it. I won't have time to digest it in time for Tuesday evening or Tuesday, whatever time people are joining. Questions?
I take it from your answer to Susan's question that we have some flexibility in how we might word or frame these questions.
Absolutely.
As long as it sort of organically comes up in the conversation.
Absolutely. Veer off them, no problem. No problem. Someone makes an interesting observation, contribution, nurture it. Don't say, oh, it's nothing to do with this question. We can't have this, excuse me. Stop. No, don't do that at all. To the contrary.
So this sounds more like an interview than a conversation.
No.
What is our part in the conversation?
You're answering the
I'm
question.
answering the question.
Oh, absolutely. But you're not answering questions. You're having
I'm
a
having a
conversation.
conversation with my point of view.
Yes, absolutely. Any more questions? Yes.
Could I ask what's the purpose?
The purpose is to raise the skill for conversation, which is the most powerful tool for social change available to us at this moment in history. There is no more powerful tool. There isn't one. I can assure you, I've explored many of them. There are other useful tools, but none more useful. Because no matter what you want to do, no matter how you interpret anything, you can't do it on your own. You'll have to have a conversation with somebody somewhere down the line. Yes.
I love the passion of conversation, but also to take a partial opinion and then something a bit more informed. Is there anything that you would recommend bringing into the conversation?
Well, yes. I'm assuming that the people you're going to have a conversation with, you know them to some extent. It's unlikely you're going to go to your local butcher that you've hardly ever said a word except, can I have a kilo of this or half a kilo of that, and start saying, could I have a conversation with you? No. It'll be people you have some, it could be a colleague, a friend, a member of family, relative, whatever it may be. So it's very, very important that you're able to convey before even the conversation that what they have to say matters a great deal. A great deal. No matter what they say, no matter what they think, it matters a great deal. That's very important. And that you care and value very much, even if they have 100% opposite view to the one you would hold on something or other. They must be convinced that this is so. Well, ideally, they must be convinced. You have to do the best you can to convince them that you're not there to push a barrow, but you're there to let the conversation flow. Let 100 flowers bloom. Okay? Any questions from online? I haven't been following it, of course, but maybe the questions that are asked here are also questions that people online might have. Okay. Last.
From your experience, is it helpful to say to someone, Look, I have this assignment and Harvard.
Well, you can. If that's your only way in, do it. I would do it differently. I would say, there's something bugging me. There's something worrying me. Can I share it? I'm quite worried. Which is true in my case. I'm very worried. You see? And I want to share it with someone to see whether they think there is a real cause for worry or I'm just worrying unnecessarily. They might be able to set me right. And I feel much better at the end of the conversation.
Joe, sorry.
Yes.
Didn't want to interrupt.
No,
I know
no,
you
no.
move to the next thing.
Yes.
I think one thing that would be interesting, I'm racking my brain, who am I going to ask?
Yes.
And I presume asking other members of this is off.
Off limits.
So, my wife's,
Off limits.
yes, that's cheating. I'm thinking, going to go about the conversations with different people rather differently because they're different people.
Yes.
It might be nice to get some feedback on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, when you're answering that last
Yes,
question
different-
in italics.
Were there different outcomes, different people?
Yeah.
And there will be.
Yeah.
Yes. All right, I think we stop. If you have a burning question, don't hesitate to send it through, okay? Because we still have a bit of work to do, if you don't mind. Okay. Now, we're still on this question we've been dealing with, which of course is the flavor of the month. And it is, I want to look at exactly what the two guests have been talking about, but perhaps in a more, well, how can I put it? In a more focused way, making clear what the problems are, but also suggesting some ways in which we might be able to move forward. Okay. First of all, we start with Ukraine to get it into focus, because that's what's precipitated this extraordinary sequel of events. Next slide. So, oh, yes, never mind. The war casualties, if they could come up. Okay, now very difficult to get precise figures because both sides either don't give information or give what undoubtedly is deliberately false information, both sides. The UN says that these are the casualties in Ukraine, civilian, but they say they're probably much higher. And that's probably correct. But how much higher, we don't know. Is it 5,000, 10,000? It's not 100,000, but it is many thousands, much more than this. Ukrainian military casualties, the military casualties so far are much greater than the civilian casualties, which is unusual for a modern war. Unusual. So, Ukrainian forces up to 20,000, maybe, by now, and Russian forces may be higher. You've got low estimates, you've got high estimates, but let's say between 10 and 25, both sides. Military casualties, killed or wounded. So the military casualties at the moment are much greater, wounded or killed, than civilian casualties, which is, well, insofar as anything can be good, it's a good thing that civilian casualties don't outnumber. In the Vietnam War, civilian casualties 9-1. 9-1. In the Vietnam War, for anyone who doesn't remember, 3 million died. This has been nothing like it. Nothing like it. Iraq War, prior, during, and since, 1 million. This will not be anything like it. But still, It's terribly worrying, but it's because it is on European soil. Okay. Now, several questions, of course. Where civilians have suffered badly, of course, is in the displacement. That is the real civilian suffering. And we can see that we have roughly, according to the figures as of a week ago, perhaps even just a few days ago, 6.1 million refugees have left Ukraine, and 7.7 million have been internally displaced. In other words, close to 14 million. This is huge by comparison with any conflict. So it's the displacement that has been so serious. Now, we'll leave that slide on. I might refer to it again. Now, of course, Russia claims, and with some justification, relentless provocation and humiliation. And it says, and there's a lot to document it, that the Russian minority in Ukraine has been persistently intimidated and harassed, and in some cases, in many cases, shot at. That, I think, is accurate. But that does not justify the use of force on this in this way. Does not. It does not justify the use of force. It does not justify the terrible suffering that's been inflicted on the people of Ukraine. So there are terrible casualties as a result of this military operation, as President Putin calls it, as war, as some others call it. But there are other casualties, which I must share with you. The sanctions that have been imposed will hurt terribly ordinary Russians, much more than the rich oligarchs. Oh, yes, they will. The oligarchs have already found routes to rechannel their assets and their resources. They will get some punishment. Percentage, somewhere between 5 and 10%, they will lose. But easily bearable. Freezing the assets of Russian central banks, Russian sovereign funds, excluding Russia from SWIFT, the international financing messaging system, suspending Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, stopping oil and gas imports, and other poorly thought out measures will terribly harm and badly damage the global financial system. And of course, it will greatly increase the cost of fuel and the cost of food. And who will suffer in their tens of millions? Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Oh yes, they will suffer a lot. These sanctions are very poorly thought out. And Western Europe and even Australia will suffer. There's no question of that. Maybe some of you have noticed the increasing price of oil already. Okay. There is a third casualty, which is the barrage of Western vitriol. Terrible. This is reminiscent of the McCarthyist period in the United States in the 1950s. Everyone who does not agree is out. You look at every US mainstream media, not a Russian voice to be heard anywhere. No Russian voice. No Russian scholar. No Russian scholar. Even the likes of fairly innocuous Dr. Gromyko and his ilk, of which there are thousands in Russia. No one's bothered to ask them. How do they assess the situation? So the mainstream media in the West, with some minor exceptions in the likes of France and Greece, has been little short of appalling. Ukrainian statements, Zelensky, heroic figure, headline news, Russian voices silent. What do they say? US military and intelligence sources, usually unnamed, and think tanks with loud voices taken as gospel. The cumulative toll of half-truths, disinformation, and outright deception will be felt for years, if not decades to come. It took 30 years to recover from the McCarthyist period. It may take us long again. And the most distressing casualty is the damage it's doing to the relationship between two major centers of power in the world, the world's two major nuclear weapon states. And the problem is not so much that there could be escalation by design. The problem is escalation by accident or miscalculation. That's the danger. Geoff Raby was a bit on the optimistic side because he thinks they're all rational, and each move that both sides make will be rational at all times. It only takes one irrational move by one side and you're in deep trouble, deep trouble. So the question, can we get out of this mess? Because it's a real mess. And the answer is with great difficulty, but possible. And I've tried to apply my mind to this question, and I propose 2 principles and 6 steps. First, the obvious thing. The guns must be silenced. The guns must be silenced sooner rather than later. Crucial. We owe it to the people of Ukraine for the guns to be silenced. But it's not enough, because the issues are so interconnected. We must approach them holistically. You can't just deal with one little problem here. Oh, is there another little problem there? I'll deal with that too. No, we have to, the big picture. You have to have the big picture, into which then you can put the different pieces of the jigsaw. So what's the first step? The first step is obvious. Everyone who's got any sense is arguing for it. It's not my proposal. A ceasefire. A ceasefire, ideally one that is monitored by the United Nations. It has to be monitored by an independent agency. Otherwise, both sides will blame the other for violations of the ceasefire. But a ceasefire won't happen. A ceasefire will not happen unless one condition is met. Maybe others too, but certainly one. Both sides have to gain something, and both sides have to concede something. Both sides have to gain something, and both sides have to concede something. What might Moscow concede? It might disagree to stop the use of force. That's a concession, a real concession, because the more force it uses, it expects, it hopes, it expects, it'll gain. Huh? It'll gain. It has to say, I'm giving that up. I'm giving that up. But in return for the ceasefire, which is what Ukraine gains, it must concede. It must concede that the legitimate grievances of Russia must be negotiated. Not necessarily agreed with completely, but negotiated. And there was movement in this direction, as Alexey Gromyko was telling us. it seems to have become a bit wobblier, that a post-conflict Ukraine will be neutral. I think that probably will happen, but there will be lots of bargaining as to how it happens. Russia will want it inscribed in the constitution of the Ukraine, with great difficulty for the constitution to be changed. Say, I've got to have that, and then cease. I've got to have the agreement to negotiate around this issue. That's all I want. Agreement to negotiate, not to get all I want in the negotiation. Agreement to negotiate seriously around 2 or 3 key questions that I have put on the table for months prior to the invasion. Okay. The second step, once the ceasefire has taken place, it won't happen before. These steps that I'm suggesting provide you with a compass by which you can assess how serious any of the protagonists are about a solution. If they're not following some of these steps, one ought to begin to have doubts in one's mind. How serious? No, after the ceasefire, not before, you can't expect it before, no further delivery of lethal military aid to Ukraine. Stop, because this is ceasefire, ideally monitored by the United Nations. And then, and that's part of the agreement that brings about the ceasefire, we've said it, the withdrawal of Russian forces. It can't be done in 1 second. It'll take weeks for it to happen. There's such a large contingent of forces and military hardware, but it should be able to be done within weeks, not months or years. And side by side with that, negotiations on Russia's legitimate long-standing concerns. Okay, but that's only beginning to do something about Ukraine. But let's face it, this is not a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It is not. It is a conflict between Russia and the United States. And Ukraine is the proxy. Just like Vietnam was the proxy. That wasn't a conflict between Vietnam and the United States. It was a conflict between the United States and China and Russia as the 2 primary backers of North Vietnam. And they were both trying to gain advantage by prosecuting the conflict in support of one or other of the 2 sides. And that's exactly what's happening here. So the ceasefire is not enough. We have to do in the Ukraine what was done in places like East Timor and Cambodia. A large UN peacekeeping force that will be there for years. How big? At least 100,000. At least 100,000. That's how big it was in Cambodia. In tiny little Timor-Leste, it was tens of thousands. If it can be done for those 2 and for others, it can be done for the Ukraine, which is much more crucial to the world stage than Timor-Leste. But that, all right, that's step 5. You probably missed. I'll send you these in the slides. I didn't want the slides to interfere too much. But the longer term, the crux is how to improve relations between Russia and the United States. And that's the most difficult. And that's why I asked the question to Alexey Gromyko. It's not the United States or Russia directly that will take the first step. It's too hard, especially right now. But France and Germany can. Macron has already had 19 hours of face-to-face discussions with Putin. Biden hasn't, and he won't. And Putin won't with him. Not for the moment. So, you allies of the United States are well placed, provided they're prepared to be a little bit independent of the American position, once these other steps are taking place, to restart a dialogue. with Russia about outstanding issues and about a European framework of security, which has been studied at enormous length. Endless commitments have been made in the past. It's nice to have a charger that's switched on. So we need a longer-term series of negotiations, which is driven primarily by friends and allies of the United States and Western Europe, and by some friends of Russia, of which, of course, China is critical. It's going to take a lot of doing to get to that sixth step, but that's the name of the game. And, you know, one has to be very crude about these things. These two gentlemen, for whom I have the greatest respect, were glossing over things because they're on public display and they hold important positions even now. To drive the point home, the Americans and the Russians are using Ukraine as fodder. Just crude as that. Fodder for their competing strategic interests. My view is the United States security establishment couldn't care less about Ukrainian lives, could not care less. If it does the supreme good of putting Russia in its place, and therefore you have to bleed Russia dry. And the only way you can bleed it dry, other than sanctions and the like, is by the Ukrainians fighting and fighting and fighting and armed to the teeth. That's the name of the game. You use Ukraine as fodder. Of course, they will never say that publicly. But if you look behind the statements, that's what it's all about. I'll come to you in a minute. So there's a lot to do, but as you will see with China, of which I'll say only 5 minutes, 6, 7 minutes, it can't rest that with governments because governments are mired in this quagmire. So expect them to come out of the quagmire of their own accord, unassisted, it just won't happen. They can't get out of it easily. They will need a lot of help. We'll come to that. John, you had a question?
Yes, Joe, I remember I was going to ask when Helen Clark gave the first talk in the series. In fact, someone did say that publicly about bleeding Russia and making sure they'd never be able to fight like this again. And that was one of the top generals waging the war in Ukraine. I've forgotten his name. It wasn't Biden, and maybe the government administration could distance itself from him. But he actually said what you just said they wouldn't say.
Well, I'm glad someone said it. Okay. Now, a word about China, very quickly, because we've already looked a little bit at China, and of course, we've discussed it with our guests. China has no intention, as I think everyone virtually has agreed who's spoken on the subject, of competing with the United States at the military level. Of course, it's building up its military strength and will continue to do so, but not to have anything like the global military projection of the United States or having anything like the nuclear arsenal at the disposal of the United States. It's not trying. There's no evidence that it's trying because it sees its strength as primarily economic, cultural, and political. Military, yes, but as second order. China, as of now, as we speak, has one military base outside its borders. It's in Djibouti, which has also French, US, and Japanese bases. And it shares, so Russia, sorry, not Russia, China shares that hosting. It has its own base. And it has secured access to port facilities in various host countries, including most recently the Solomon Islands. But usually, these port facilities follow in the trail of Chinese infrastructure investments. And that's the name of the game, infrastructure investment, because that ties the country to China, to China's fortunes. If key parts of your infrastructure, your economic and social infrastructure, are funded directly or indirectly by China, you have a vested interest in China's continuing prosperity. It's cleverly thought out, and it's pursued relentlessly. Relentlessly. That's what the Belt Road Initiative is about. So, yes, there is an urgent need for reduction of tensions between the United States and China, just as there is between the United States and Russia. And for that, you need a dialogue. But the dialogue with China is more difficult than the dialogue with Russia. And we're seeing how difficult that's going to be. Why is it more difficult? Because, as a few observers, not many, unfortunately, have remarked, have noticed, this is not just a power shift. It is a power shift. There is a power shift going on from the West to the East. It's happening everywhere. Don't think it's just China. It's India. It's Indonesia. Will soon be the 5th largest economic power in the world, outdoing most major European economies. It's moving towards the East. This is so much more than a power shift. I have to understand that. It's a civilizational shift. And the rules and the values and the philosophies and the ideologies which have been associated with Western dominance for 300 years, I've got news for you, it's finished. It's finished. It only exists in the imaginations, fertile imaginations of Western people, that it will continue. It's finished. You know the sanctions that the United States has imposed on Russia? No one outside Europe and its ally, of course, Australia, Canada, and so on, is implementing them. They've made it clear. They're not going to be implementing them. South Korea not implementing them. India not implementing them. And so that's how it's going to remain. Biden went to see Modi and said, Mr. Biden, the sanctions will not be applied. Oh, and Biden said, let's have a friendly conversation about other things. What can you do about it? The majority of the world, you see, the West, fertile imagination, they passed a UN Security Council resolution condemning Russia. But when it came to the crunch, applying of economic sanctions, less than 1 in 4 countries in the world is applying. It's moving to the East. Most countries know where their bread is buttered. And it's not in China, and it's not in the United States. Increasingly, it's in China. So there's a shift going on. And we have to accept the fact that so-called liberal democratic values are going to be in the minority. I'm sorry to say. Don't have to like it. You have to acknowledge it. You have to acknowledge it. That's how it is right now, and it's going to remain so for some considerable time. And many people are saying in Africa and in Asia, see how China handled COVID. You can keep your liberal democratic values. I want that COVID result. Thank you. End of the conversation. Yes.
See the timeline on the downfall of the US dollar.
Oh, it's hard to tell, because some people have predicted it in years gone by, and it hasn't quite happened. But clearly, Russia and China and some other countries want more and more their trade not to be not to take place on the basis of the US dollar. So the question is, can they achieve a critical mass? And it'll require a lot of thinking and doing to pull that off. it may take some little time. It won't be tomorrow or next year, but it could be within 10 years. Okay, two more minutes. If we're thinking Asia Pacific, a dialogue with China is crucial. And the reason it doesn't move as much forward as we would like it is that it can't be political to begin with. It has to be cultural. You can't speak to China and know nothing about Confucius. You can't. Useless. You're not embedded in the Confucian mindset. You can't understand how either business leaders, political leaders, scholarly leaders, scholars, intellectuals think. The Confucian hold is extraordinary. It seemed to be on the going downhill during the days of the Cultural Revolution and period of Maoist thought, but has become increasingly important. In fact, one of the key aspects of Xi Jinping's thought is the integration of Confucian values into Chinese policymaking. So if we're going to have a discussion between Chinese and Western political leaders, intellectuals, scholars, business leaders, there needs to be a discussion about this cultural aspect and the cultural foundations on which the two are basing their ideas of the good, the legal, and the proper way forward. So once you do that in that framework, not that you adopt the Confucian model, but that you understand where it's coming from, and then you speak about your side of things, then you may be able to make a step forward. Now, I want to handle what for some is the most vexing issue, which is not so much Taiwan, or at least in the public discourse, not so much the South China Sea, but human rights. Is that a complex question? Yes, it is. And it's going to remain very challenging for some considerable time. There is no doubt that under Xi Jinping, Chinese authorities have become more centralized. They want to maintain the dominance of the Chinese Communist Party, and they want to ensure a fully integrated China. These are have become two totally non-negotiable positions, not just in terms of discussions with other countries, other governments, but inside China. You may not contest either of these two propositions. You may not. You're not allowed to. You can, of course, privately, and no doubt some people do privately, but you cannot question the dominance of the Chinese Communist Party, and you cannot question the objective of a fully integrated China inside China. And that's what Xi Jinping has done, for better or for worse. That's the situation that obtains at the moment. And that has human rights implications. In the case of Xinjiang, the Uyghur region, Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And Geoff Raby mentioned them all four. Does that mean we can't express our concern or be concerned about the people of these places, Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong? Of course we have to. If we're committed to human rights, we have, but which way we do it? Not as a stick to beat China. See, we've found a stick and we're going to beat you and beat you with it till you say, no more, please, it's hurting too much. Apart from the fact it won't work, it is just not doing any good for the people of Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, or Taiwan. So And China has a very easy comeback, very easy, which has global support. That's the problem for us, those who are so-called concerned about human rights values. They say it's another name for hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. What are you doing about human rights in your ally, Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia's situation is worse than anything happening in China. But silence. We can't afford it. The oil and the ship, it's a two-way relationship, Saudi Arabia, you know. We get all your oil at reasonable prices, and we sell you hundreds of billions of arms. We buy your oil with our arms. You'd be mad. You'd have to have rocks in your head to give that away. You're not going to do it for the human rights of the Saudi Arabian people, not in the. You have to put that on the table. Hypocrisy. Treatment of indigenous peoples in Australia. That's the obvious China comeback. You talk of human rights in Uyghur, 10 times better than the treatment of indigenous nations in Australia and Canada and some other places. Are you prepared to put your treatment of indigenous rights, your handling of indigenous rights, to the same probing scrutiny internationally as you would like it to happen in Uyghur? Silence. I mean, if Australia had any sense, it would say, please invite all the Chinese scholars and experts to come to all parts of Australia and make an assessment of what we're doing on indigenous rights. And we will look seriously at your recommendations. Why not? You want to do it the other way, but not this way. Hypocrisy. So we have to put the West, our house, in order so that we can speak with authority on human rights. We're doing it inside our countries, and we're doing it with all the countries that we're dealing with, whether they're allies or not. We don't exclude friends and allies because they're strategically valuable to us. So we need to engage in a conversation from a position of moral strength. We have to put our houses in order, but we mustn't let go of rights in areas that China controls. Now, and I'm sorry it's taken 2 minutes extra, but this is the final point. To be able to have this discussion with China, serious discussion, you really need to be on top of the human rights issue. You really need to know it back to front and sideways. You need to know every treaty that China has signed and every treaty that China has not signed. You need to know every organization of which it's a member and every organization of which it's not a member. We need to know it back to front. Mr. Morrison and Mr. Alexey, they know it back to front. Or even their advisors, they know it back to front. No, they don't. That's the problem. They can't have a human rights discussion. They don't know their stuff on human rights. Now, as it happens, China is a member of the Human Rights Council. Okay? It has served 4 3-year terms already since it was established in 2006, and has even been appointed to the Council's consultative group. It has even accepted the principle of responsibility to protect. Believe it or not, it has accepted it, signed the unanimous document. So, once you know all that and what goes with it, and I haven't got time to go into it, you say to your Chinese hosts in the tactful and friendly way with a smile, we greatly value your presence on these forums. Where would we be without your presence? But your presence is a testament to the fact that you believe in international monitoring of human rights. Otherwise, why are you on the Human Rights Council of the United Nations? You believe in the principle, and we're with you completely. We believe in the principle of international review of human rights. Will you accept it when it comes to China? Will you? Let them answer it. It has never been put in those terms, to my knowledge, by a Western leader in sophisticated fashion. Do you agree that your own performance must be open to international monitoring and that ours should be as well? Do you believe that we should treat indigenous nations properly? Do you believe that if we don't, you should speak out? And if you believe in that, then the reverse must also be true. And you can argue it on Confucian principles. Reciprocal dialogue, which is the key of Confucianism. Reciprocal dialogue. And you've got another, President Xi Jinping has given it to you. He says that he is committing China to the principle of harmony. Speech after speech after speech. And because it is, he says, at the heart of Confucian wisdom. What we want in Chinese discourse, he has said repeatedly, is harmony, not uniformity. Have you seized on that sentence? Harmony, not uniformity. The harmony principle, therefore, requires that we discard, this is Confucianism, practices that foment resentments, grievance, hatred, and violence. No good for Confucian thinking. And that's in line with your approach, isn't it? You say to the Chinese government, if it is, we will support you. And if it isn't, we will criticize you. We're taking your own principle to heart. We don't go to the Enlightenment. We don't go to Western liberal values and democracy. We go to Confucianism. And we can argue it in depth and in detail and see what happens. It'll only be a small start, but it's got to happen. They've got to know that we understand the basic principles on which they're basing social arrangements as well, or nearly as well, as they do. Now, none of this will happen. None of this will happen. This is just pie in the sky, the things I've said, until and unless. I'm no utopian thinker. This is not going to happen until and unless there is a powerful mobilization of civil society. Without that, it won't happen. It's got to start somewhere. So these questions must become integral to the public, national, and international conversation. And who makes the conversation? The likes of you and me. The leverage, the initiative, is in our hands, not in Morrison, Biden, Albanese, or Macron. They will react once they see a powerful movement, a current of opinion, which is sweeping across societies, which becomes dominant. It has happened before on many issues, which the movement against apartheid is a classic instance, but there have been many others. I finish on this. It's often been said, including by Gorbachev, that whenever he met Reagan in several summits, as the Soviet Union was declining, hadn't yet imploded, but was declining, he said, whenever I sat with him in a one-to-one conversation, I always did it from a position of strength. Always. Because there was a third chair, empty. And the chair was occupied by Western movements, civil society movements, weakening the hands of presidents in Europe and the United States. He knew that. He knew in detail that the Catholic bishops of the United States, which are not the Catholic bishops today, had issued a major declaration that they would give the United States between 5 and 10 years for nuclear disarmament to occur, steps towards. And if they didn't, they would declare nuclear weapons immoral and illegal. And 40% of President Reagan's generals were devout Catholics. And it changed dramatically. He then, the axis of evil, you know all this, those of you who lived in those days, he called Russia the axis of evil, and then he called Gorbachev my best friend. My best friend. Chummy. It was extraordinary. And they came within an inch of eliminating all nuclear weapons. Within an inch, less than an inch. The document was signed, virtually signed, until the minders came in and said, excuse us, would you give us a bit more time to think about this element and that? And that was the undoing. So movements happen, but it waits to happen around the kinds of issues we're talking about. Shall we stop? We've gone way over time, 6, 7 minutes, 10 minutes. I apologize. You must be falling asleep. Yes?
With the Confucians answer, how much is the cult of Mao part of that? How much is the cult of Mao part of that?
No, he didn't push Confucianism. He rebelled against it.